It is here, 3 miles outside of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, some 600 feet below the surface, that lies the final resting place of the U.S. submarine R-12 and her crew of 42 men who were entombed at the bottom of the sea when the vessel mysteriously sank on June 12, 1943. Lying undisturbed on the ocean floor for nearly 70 years, the submarine was a forgotten piece of World War II history until late 2010, when marine explorers Tim Taylor and Christine Dennison would discover the R-12's exact location. What began as a single mission to find a sunken shipwreck off the Florida coast would evolve into a 3-year odyssey involving multiple expeditions, the U.S. Navy, and the building of an experimental underwater robot, all in pursuit of attempting to explain the mysterious events which led to the R-12's tragic demise. On the morning of June 12, 1943, the USS R-12, with a crew of 47 sailors, departed Key West Naval Station on what was to be a routine mission. But just a few hours into her voyage, while the submarine surfaced, disaster would strike, and the R-12 would sink to the bottom of the ocean in a matter of minutes. Only 5 members of the crew, including the captain, would survive the disaster. Despite personal testimony and an official investigation by a Naval Board of Inquiry, the exact reasons behind the submarine's sinking could never be fully explained, and the families of the lost sailors would be forever left wondering what exactly occurred that fateful afternoon. Leading the R-12 expedition is the captain of the research vessel Tiburon, Tim Taylor, an accomplished explorer, naturalist, and conservationist. With more than 20 years at sea, his contributions to the world of marine exploration span multiple disciplines, including biology and archaeology. Joined by expedition partner Christine Dennison, a veteran explorer and world-class scuba diver, Christine was the first woman to not only dive beneath the ice caps of the high Arctic, but also to swim below the Amazon's Rio Negro.
I went looking for the R-12. I knew it was out there through books and listed in various obscure references, but I was frankly fascinated that no one had gone looking for it before. All the archaeology, all the historical elements of an underwater wreck are there, but really it's a tomb for 42 people and 42 lives and 42 families.
The reason finding the R-12 after 70 years is so important is not only the 42 lives of the men that are still on board and entombed at 600 feet, but the families of those men that have waited for answers, for closure, for some information on what happened to the submarine, where the submarine lies, and even for us to know a bit of history.
A World War I era submarine, the R-12 was built in 1919 and saw active service for 13 years. After serving in Hawaii, Panama, and California, she was eventually berthed in the Reserve Fleet in 1932. But as a result of the outbreak of war in Europe, the R-12 was reactivated in July 1940.
The R-13, the R-16, and the R-14. Those are the ones that were recommissioned out of the Navy Yard. The new submarines were being built that time by Electric Boat Company in New London, but there was no other new construction.
Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States declaration of war, the U.S. began increasing the size of its naval forces.
We're producing them as rapidly as we can. That means we have to produce the crews as rapidly as we can. That's why there's a lot of pressure to train them. That's why submarines like R-12 get a very serious workouts. They were trained on submarines like R-12. That makes a submarine like R-12 much more important than you might otherwise imagine. We're solving the torpedo problem. The submarines are about to become quite effective. A lot really rests on that submarine offensive.
By 1943, the war had reached a turning point as the Allied offensive had started to gain momentum. In the Pacific Campaign, American submarines were inflicting tremendous damage to the Japanese Navy.
The Japanese still can imagine that they have a shot of surviving the war. The submarines kind of ruined that shot very effectively. By late 43, everything works. And then in less than 2 years, basically they wipe out the Japanese merchant fleet. They made a tremendous contribution to the war, very largely unsung at the time because they were quite secret, but way, way out of proportion to numbers. Extraordinary.
Well, there's a lot of people out there in the ocean that are looking for lost ships, and sometimes their motives are different than those that we in the preservation community would have. So when the news of the discovery of R-12 popped up, of course, it wasn't a big, popped up eyebrow. It was a, I wonder who these guys are. Just a quick check around on Tiburon and the rest, and said, oh no, these are guys that care. The approach was absolutely right. It was a question of learning more about the sub, of learning more about what had happened, about commemorating loss, and conducting more inquiry. It's a big ocean. Not every shipwreck out there belongs to every archaeologist or to the preservation movement. These shipwrecks are part of our common heritage. So it was delightful to learn that Tiburon, Tim Taylor, and all of the crew were working on this.
Our first major challenge to overcome was depth. Once you get past 100 meters, scuba diving and sending people down on self-contained breathing apparatus is not practical. We had to actually deploy robotic equipment.
AUVs are the underwater equivalent of the Air Force's unmanned drones. Except due to underwater communication limitations, these robots have to rely on pre-programming, combined with their internal automatic reasoning. Searching for possible targets that match the dimensions of the submarine, they targeted those anomalies with higher resolution scans. Exchanging the sonar with the camera payload, the AUV was flown just meters over the submarine, taking hundreds of pictures.
Once we downloaded the images of the AUV, we then assembled a mosaic. When you take pictures from an AUV, it's kind of like taking pictures of Manhattan from a balloon. We were able to put together a full picture of what the sub looked like before we launched our next expedition. We were very excited with our initial success.
I couldn't believe the images we were capturing of the R-12. As we were flying over the submarine and the images just kept coming in, it was the most unbelievable thing to see.
Now that we had the photos in a photo mosaic of the R-12, we could then piece them together with the historical data and come up with a much more accurate timeline of the events that surround the sinking of the R-12.
The day of the sinking was like any other operational day. The R-12 departed the dock at 7:16 in the morning, performed sounding exercises until midday, and surfaced to regroup for an afternoon of torpedo training. Once on the surface, the crew rotated out for lunch, while the captain and watch crew converted the submarine to run as a topside vessel. Shortly after noon, while the R-12 was on the surface and the captain and 4 crew were outside on the conning tower, a large thump was heard on the starboard side. This was reported to the captain, who surveyed the outside for possible objects they might have struck. He reported back that all was clear. At 12:20, the alarm sounded, and it was reported that they were taking on water in the forward battery. But within the next 2 minutes, the R-12 sank. Captain Shelby would later report, it took only 15 seconds from checking how she was riding to losing his grip on the periscope as he was washed overboard.
It went down like this. And so there was no way that the crew could hang on to operate the survival equipment that they had. Shelby stepped on the hatch and told the exec to put a pressure on the boat. That was the idea he had, so we'd force the water out and give these people an opportunity to live.
The survivors grouped together in shock. After 3 minutes of floating on the surface, an explosion of bubbles appeared without warning, throwing water 6 to 10 feet in the air, covering a circular area of about 50 yards in diameter. This lasted close to 15 minutes, and air bubbles continued to boil to the surface of the water for at least another 30 minutes, bringing great quantities of oil and cork to the surface. Cork was used as sound insulation inside the hulls of submarines. The survivors now knew the fate of their crewmates.
The reason that the 5 survived is that they were at the right place at the right time. They simply were washed off the conning tower as the boat sunk out from underneath them in 15 seconds.
When the submarine disappears, no one notices for about 5 hours. And even then, it's only because the plane spots an oil slick. And the captain keeps saying, well, you know, we're due to do this practice run. Surely someone will notice. And the first question they ask is, well, did you notice? No, we figured out if something went wrong, he went back to base. They run the collision alarm. When things begin to go bad, at the same moment, the officer in the control room is saying, we have water in the forward battery tank. The commanding officer on the bridge tries to close the hatch, so at least they get some water tightness. They try to blow air out of the tanks. The tanks don't hold up. They can't blow them well enough, and this was flooding, heavy flooding, and it happens awfully fast. That's the real surprise. Then the ship is so heavy by the bow that nothing can save it. When the submarine starts to sink, it goes down initially flat, and then it suddenly goes down by the bow at a very steep angle. First it's 30 degrees, then they talk about it being almost vertical in the water. When the survivors see the back end of the submarine up with the propeller still turning, that's almost vertical in the water. And that means that whatever flooded it real fast at the front end. A little while before, they'd been submerged, they'd blown their tanks, they'd surfaced, they'd done all the same things. Something changed at that moment, not because they'd been running around with something made out of rust. Something went sour, but no one really knew what it was. Now, there was some testimony from inside the sub that there had been a bump. Probably what sounded pretty small because you didn't even hear it on the bridge. And the guess you have to have is that it was a relatively small bump that opened something up, probably a seam in the hull. Where there's internal corrosion of some kind, you won't even notice. And if you get a solid bump in it, that might be enough to get you.
Well, we referred to them as floating coffins because obviously they were old, decrepit.
A few days after the sinking, the survivors were assembled and a court of inquest was convened to investigate what happened to the R-12. After 5 days of testimony from the surviving crew members and a panel of submarine experts, the mystery would remain unsolved, resulting only in further speculation.
See, one of the outcomes of a board of inquiry is there some kind of big system failure? And it was something they couldn't see, so there's no warning to them. Whatever's happened is fairly quiet. If there were an explosion, that's the first thing someone would have said.
The sinking left little evidence of what had occurred on that tragic afternoon.
After reading the Navy transcripts, you're left with even more questions than answers. You're wondering why they drew conclusions that they drew at the time, why they didn't ask more detailed information on the thump on the side of the boat. Were there crew or crew errors involved?
Were the torpedo tubes open? Were they using the submarine to test classified equipment? What was the mysterious thump?
There would be no further information on the R-12 for the next 68 years. Unfortunately, included in the speculation was the possibility that crew error played a part in the sinking.
I am sure that these men did everything they possibly could to save that sub, but unfortunately it was just too much water coming in too fast, and there was nothing they could really do. But I believe they did everything they possibly could up until the very last second.
2 generations later, a heavy cloud still hangs over the legacy of the R-12 crew and the families.
One of the things that we found in doing our research and meeting with the families was that we had family members all across the country, and for nearly 70 years they had been linked together by this terrible tragedy, and yet none of them had any answers.
There have been so many stories about what happened to this boat, most of them word of mouth, hearsay.
Of course, it's a mystery as to why it sank and why it sank so quickly. And somebody had the theory that it was such an old boat that They thought possibly the batteries had broken loose and made a hole in the hull.
Somebody said, the ship it was so old it just fell apart. So I don't know, and I don't think the inquiry has any really hard and fast conclusions.
There just seems to have been an obsession by the Board of Inquiry involving issues involving the front torpedo tubes. I believe that the writing of the vents was a smoking gun of an indication of a problem with the ballast tanks.
Maybe because the Navy felt it was a little bit culpable in its sinking, in the fact that the ship went down, and they didn't want a lot of questions, or I don't know.
Because my father's belief was that there was an injustice done to the crew of the R-12. If you read the end of the Board of Inquiry, despite all of the other concerns, the board, the admiral in charge of the Board of Inquiry blames someone among the crew for not doing their duty or acting properly aboard the R-12. And I don't think that's the case. And my father knew it wasn't the case.
The R-12 in my lifetime was completely forgotten, overlooked, negated. Nobody knew what it was half the time, even when we went to the memorial in Connecticut.
It's kind of it's been, I guess, the forgotten boat.
These are people who went out and saved our world.
I think what pains these families the most is that no one has ever gone back. No one has told the story of the R-12.
It became clear to us that we had to return to the R-12 and get a closer look.
In the next phase of the expedition, we needed to be self-reliant and self-sufficient. And in order to do that, we decided to build our own machine.
You haven't lived until you've hung $500,000 of your own property 600 feet under the water and drug it around and hoping you don't lose it.
Otis was named after Otis Barton, who worked with William Beebe on the bathysphere. Otis is approximately 800 pounds. He can dive to a depth of 600 meters. He is outfitted with underwater high-definition cameras, laser measuring cameras, fiber optic cable, and he has a multi-beam sonar. He's capable of carrying multiple payloads, and he has a full-motion manipulator arm.
The second phase of the expedition was now set for 2012. Under permit from the U.S. Navy and utilizing Otis, the team set out to film the R-12.
We're at about 575 feet, and then all of a sudden, out of the dark, we see the sub for the first time in 70 years. And everyone takes a moment to just take it all in.
What you are seeing is the first ever footage of the USS R-12 as she sits today in 600 feet of water, 3 miles outside of Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. She rests on a hard bottom, sitting in an upright position, undisturbed, but for the schools of fish and coral that have made this their home. Just after the bow section, you will notice the structural hull failure the team believes was caused by impact with the bottom. Moving to the conning tower, you can see the partially open main hatch that Captain Shelby valiantly stood on as the R-12 went down. Last is the engineering section, crushed from a massive implosion, which the 5 survivors witnessed on the surface as a 10-foot-high eruption of bubbles, oil, and debris. After 70 years, the families of the R-12 were able to see their loved one's final resting place, offering them a sense of closure. Returning to the R-12 in November of 2013 to continue their research, the team would soon discover something extraordinary, something that their previous research had suggested was impossible.
When we were first coming into the wreck and filming, we came across something that we never, ever thought we'd find.
In the calm, clear waters at 600 feet, the team came upon a very significant artifact, a piece of history that had been frozen in time.
It stood out like a bronze beacon. just waiting to be found.
It was the ship's bell, sitting outside of the submarine on the back of the conning tower, as if untouched by the tragedy.
Whenever you explore a lost ship, the one iconic item you want to look for is the bell. It rings in the watches. It has the name of the vessel engraved on it. It is actually the heart of the ship. Given naval tradition and operating procedures, we did not think the bell would be aboard. This bell belongs in a museum. It may be the only bell ever recovered from the 52 lost World War II submarines.
Once raised, the bell can be placed in a permanent memorial, serving as a lasting symbol to the commitment and great sacrifice that the American submariners gave in the defense of their country.
Our discovery of the R-12 bell has turned our mapping expedition into a recovery expedition.
In order to preserve this rare piece of history and honor the men of the USS R-12, the team will be returning to the site to undertake the difficult task of recovery. Using Otis, in conjunction with the latest generation of diving systems, they will set out to bring the bell to the surface. But the recovery mission cannot wait forever. The continuing deterioration of the submarine's hull, as well as the risk of the R-12 being plundered by treasure hunters, is far too great. The time to reclaim the bell is now, before it is lost forever.